Hello, listeners, English-speaking listeners. This is a video lecture on Mary Wollstonecraft, made by me. My name is Jos de Wit. I'm a Dutchman, historian and philosopher, and I've given a lecture. I'm involved in the humanist movement in the Netherlands, and for many years I've been giving lectures about humanism, and especially about philosophers who have influenced modern humanism. Lately, I have given a course on women of the Enlightenment, in which participated Mary Wollstonecraft, quite probably known in the United Kingdom, but hopefully elsewhere as well. Because there was quite a lot of interest in this course, I decided to make an English version of my lecture on Mary Wollstonecraft, that I would be able to present my findings and my story about her, about this remarkable woman, to English-speaking listeners and viewers. I hope you will enjoy this, and what more, if you are able to find some inspiration in the life of this great woman and forerunner of the modern feminist movement. The proceedings of this lecture are as follows. I will start with telling something in general about women in the Enlightenment, the role of women in the Enlightenment, especially the more active role they have. Then I will turn on to tell something about England in the 18th century, as it was the birthing land, or the birthing country. And for most part, she's been living in this country, Mary Wollstonecraft. I will then proceed with telling a bit more about girls' education in the 18th century, as Mary Wollstonecraft was a teacher herself and started her career with giving lessons to young girls. More in particular, I will talk then about the coming of the radical movement in the United Kingdom and its relationship with development of the American Revolution, as it both influenced Mary Wollstonecraft and her ideas about human rights. The main part then will obviously then consist of telling the life and works of Mary Wollstonecraft. Now I'll tell something about Mary as a person, her main writings and the main ideas of Mary Wollstonecraft. And I will focus in on her most famous writing, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Still very interesting and very important as a contribution to the modern feminist movement. And I will end my lecture with a conclusion and a question, which I will reserve for the last part. I guess that most of the listeners will be familiar, at least for some way, with the development and the movement of the Enlightenment, but very generally speaking, it was a broad social and political and philosophical movement starting in the beginning of the 17th century and during into late of the 18th century. And it was all about a new view of mankind and the world. One can say that before that, Christianity dominated the view of the world, how the world was constituted, where man came from and what was man's duty in this life. But this all changed with new scientific discoveries, developments, which ended the authority of the church and both the Bible as the basis of knowledge. Instead, a new vision on mankind, a new vision on reality became, in which the main basic, well, as you might call it, the cosmos, was constituted by nature, and man's place in it. This had large consequences for the ideas about mankind and the duties of mankind in this life. And from there on developed a more positive view of man, of mankind, as being able to use its reason against animals in nature, and not only an ability to use his reason, but also a moral duty to use reason. And this all with the intention of bettering, improving the society and happiness for mankind. A lot of stress in the Enlightenment, a lot of attention was given to education and to the development of knowledge. And this also included visions of people and visions of men about women. What was the position of women? What were they able to do? But unfortunately, perhaps one might say that most of the ideas about women in the 18th century, as for instance, written down in the famous encyclopedia, a large work developed in the middle of the 18th century by a host of a group of philosophers directed by Diderot and D'Alembert. Most of the visions, nearly all the articles written in this encyclopedia, including the articles about women, were written about men. And one can see a certain ambivalence of these men about the abilities and the position of a woman in society. Not was denied that women were also members of mankind. But on the other hand, it was stated generally that women's abilities were considered as less large, less great as men's abilities, especially the ability and the possibility of developing knowledge, developing reason, and developing sound moral judgment. So one can see that a lot of views on women still were quite prejudiced in the 18th century, as it was mostly written by men. Nevertheless, considering the situation of women in the century before that, it was generally assumed that the position of women improved in the 18th century, so much that it sometimes is called as the century of women. And this has mainly to do with the fact that education of women was improved. Whereas at the beginning of the century, about 14% of women, girls, were literate. At the end of the 18th century, it was reaching the amount of about 30% of women being literate. This amount was even larger for Protestant countries like England and the United Provinces, Scandinavia, as it was more important in those countries from a religious perspective for women to read. Anyhow, besides the fact that women in general improved their literacy, and literacy of women was improved, there are three main roles of women in the Enlightenment on their own. The first major and very important role of women in the Enlightenment was that they were, to say, the keepers of the social networks and the inventors of the social networks between the philosophers and between all people, not only noble people from the nobility, but also from the bourgeoisie, from the citizens, to gather together and share and spread the ideas of Enlightenment. And this happened mostly in what's called the lounges, or in French, les salons. The lounge was a phenomenon that was mainly kept intact by women. Of course, women from the upper classes, the women of the nobility, from the richer bourgeoisie. And it became a habit that if you have any esteem of yourself as a woman of the higher classes, you would start a lounge, a salon. And this happened only once a week, generally on a Tuesday afternoon, for instance. And then you invited people you knew, amongst whom, of course, philosophers, but also other important men and women besides that. You had an introduction by some famous philosopher, and then you had discussion, and of course, not to forget to drink and eat. It's quite important. On this picture here, we see the famous French Madame Joffrin, who held a lounge in Paris in the middle of the 18th century. And one can see here the philosopher giving a lecture. And on the background, we see a statue of Voltaire, one of the most famous philosophers of the time, of course, seeing if everything goes well. These lounges, these salons were very important in the spreading and the exchange of ideas. So that was a very important role for women. Mainly, of course, this happened in Paris, which was seen as the capital of the Enlightenment, but also very obviously also in London and other major cities in Europe. The second role, important role of women behind, or women in the Enlightenment, was the woman behind the philosopher. Most of the important philosophers of the 18th century were for a shorter or longer time engaged in with women, maybe their wives, their lovers, or whatever, and they formed usually a very important stimulating or inspirational source for their ideas. So, for instance, if we're talking about Voltaire, we cannot fail to mention the name of Émilie du Châtelet. She was a long-time mistress of Voltaire, but she was his senior in knowledge of mathematics and the natural sciences. For many years, he was a guest at her palace in Lorraine, and there she had built a laboratory in which they both did scientific proofs and tried to develop their knowledge of science and mathematics. So nearly every philosopher of that age had a very important and very influential wife behind it. And the third role was of female writers and philosophers in their own right, amongst whom Mary Wollstonecraft was one of the most important women. And these female writers, they gave a special flavor to the enlightenment of our ideas. Of course, they shared many ideas about liberty, about human rights, about the use of reason, a general belief, if one would say, a certain optimism about the future of mankind, but they gave some important new accents to these ideas. One of the most important accents these writers and philosophers was that they drew the attention not only on life in the public sphere, but also in the private sphere. It is all very well being an enlightened person, being a philosopher, standing in the middle of in the public, in open places, but how do you behave behind the front door? It's so that is where the intention was. Become a moral, responsible person, not only in the public life, but also in private life. Next to that, they devoted quite a lot of attention to education, to family life, and other kind of important things. So the female writers and philosophers of the 18th century, of the Enlightenment, were important for enlarging the scope of the Enlightenment ideas. When we are talking about Mary Wollstonecraft, it is obligatory to tell something of the country where she was born in and was raised, and that was England in the 18th century. England at that time was counted as the richest country in the world, and that was mainly due to the quickly expanding colonial empire of the British. which afforded them to earn loads of money. And this money was invested in all kinds of projects and all kinds of activities. For instance, it was invested, the money that was earned in colonial ware was first invested in refinement and culture. Thanks to the 18th century, we see all the large houses, castles, manors, which you find everywhere in England. And the English in that time also developed a special way of arranging gardens. The English garden is one of the English inventions and contributions to the 18th century landscape. So the richness, the richness was displayed everywhere around the country. The second way in which the money was used was in investment, economical investment, first starting with the agrarian revolution. Also, thanks to scientific explorations and technical improvements, the output of agriculture in the 18th century increased very quickly. It was for improving the breeding races of cattle, enlarging and enriching agricultural area, for instance, by the enclosures, bringing into culture the common grounds. And this great expanded agricultural output made it possible that more money was earned by agriculture. And it was quite, well, not only fashionable, but also profitable for an Englishman with some money to invest this money into new areas of agricultural land. Even Mary Wollstonecraft's father was involved in this, although he had unfortunately a poor hand in tending his land, so he didn't make much profit. But there was a lot of gentlemen who did very well. The second way of economical investment with colonial money was done in the starting of the famous Industrial Revolution, which developed first in England. Due to technological advances, mainly the invention of the steam engine, first by Newcomen and later on by James Watt, this new machine, this new provision of power was used to enlarge and improve the production of, for instance, cloth. This was mainly done in the Midlands, and that is where the heartland of the Industrial Revolution is. And the speedily advancing production of against much cheaper prices was the beginning of the richness of England in the 19th century. So this all made England, whereas it was already a rich country, even more richer, thanks to the improvement and the embetterment in quality and quantity of both agrarian and industrial production. England had the great advantage in the 18th century as being a country with a relatively very peaceful political development. Alternatively, power was shared. Apologies for some slight interruption. But I was telling that England was, to say, an example of peaceful political development. The power in government was shared alternatively between the Whigs and the Tories. Mostly of the time, the Whigs were in charge. And they were, well, most of them were landed gentry. And they had a great interest in a liberal and economic affluent policy. Although now and then England was involved in war on the continent, it tried as much to prevent losing too many people and most of all letting the fighting do by other people, which went fairly well until the colonies in North America rebelled, but then we are speaking about later in the century. England was also a country of very broad intellectual and cultural improvement. I will in a few moments tell something more about the Enlightenment in England. But to mention this person, Dr. Samuel Johnson, is very important because he was the first person to write an English comprehensive English dictionary. And also by writing stories and plays, he did much to promote the popular use of English language. And also thanks to him, we thank the picture, the general picture of the affluent English society and the English gentleman to his, well, propagating the English way of life. Although the Enlightenment is generally set in France, and France was seen as the leading country, to be in fact, England's contribution to the Enlightenment was very, if not to say well, more on the background, but was very important. First, due to the fact that some very important Enlightenment thinkers came from the United Kingdom. One very important thinker, political thinker, was of course John Locke, but he was already active in the 17th century, and he developed some very important things about first his essay concerning human understanding. He's seen as the father of empirism, which means that our knowledge is basically founded on our senses. The stimuli are founded to our senses, and that's why he called empiricist. But he was also known as the founding father of modern liberal democracy in his famous essays, two treatises on government. In the 18th century, this man, David Hume, was also a very important philosopher, and he was also seen as an empiricist philosopher, which means he took on the line by John Locke, seeing the senses as a basis of our understanding, but he developed this even further and putting some strong doubts on the ability of man of really having thorough knowledge. And so for that, he is also seen as a kind of a skepticist. A third very important English philosopher from the Enlightenment was, of course, Adam Smith, more seen as an economical thinker, but in his The Wealth of Nations is also, you can see it as a political, social, and a political philosophical book. Because contrary to the idea we have in, he was not at all propagating ruthless capitalism. No, he said all the economic activities should be aimed at improving the general prosperity of the nation as a whole, not only the prosperity of some few individuals. And well, in that he was some of the forerunners of the later utilitarians, like Jeremy Bentham, also from the 18th century, said that the happiness of the greatest possible numbers should be the aim of every society. England was in the 18th century seen as the most important country for science. That is mainly due to the discoveries of Sir Isaac Newton about gravity. But it had a strong tradition already in the 18th century of being the hallmark of modern natural science. If you wanted to be, well, a known person learn more about natural science, you should go to the United Kingdom in those ages. And the proliferation of Enlightenment ideas was in England also going very smoothly thanks to an enormous amount of journals and the output production of journals. As England was one of the most literate countries of Europe, more people started to read and obtain journals, newspapers, and things like that. And so the British population was seen as the best informed people of those days. And we thank to the 18th century, perhaps it did even more, the development of a large amount of very important, still existing daily newspapers like the Times. Due to his prosperous situation, his relatively peaceful, if one may say, democratic form of government, thanks to a certain tolerance for other beliefs other than the Anglican Church or Church of England belief, England was, for many, especially French philosophers, seen as a model country, as an example, if you want to. For instance, Voltaire, who was in England between 1725 and 1730, and wrote his account of English society as the Lettres philosophiques, the philosophical letters, in which he praised England to a large extent and held England as a model to his French compatriots, which, as one might understand, was not quite easily taken. We're talking of Mary Wollstonecraft. We must tell something about the girls' education, the state of the art in the 18th century. Because she started her career, like I said, as a teacher, and she was a theorist on girls' and ladies' education, women's education, and she saw the lack of education as one of the main sources of the suppression of women. We're talking about education for girls and for women in general. We must go back to the Middle Ages, starting around 1400, when there was a French philosopher, female philosopher, her name was Christine de Pizan, and she wrote a book, The City of Women, La Cité des Dames. And in that, she stated the proposition that women were at least as intelligent as men, and they should have the same opportunities, especially in education. And this started a long century, during discussion about the utility and the possibility of women as having the same intellectual possibilities as men. Strange and awkward as it may seem to us, there were many, many men at that time, not only men, but unfortunately also women, who thought that women by nature did not have the same intelligence or the same possibility of intelligence as men. And it was starting in the 17th century, especially in England, that this idea, this prejudice about women's intelligence was seriously challenged. And it was done as first by Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote in 1694 this book, A Serious Proposal to the Ladies for the Advancement of Their True and Greatest Interest. In this, she propagated the development of genuine and true education for women on the same level as education for boys. And this had some success in the 18th century, especially in England. Because how was the education of girls arranged? A lot of girls from the lower classes were simply educated by their mothers. They had some rudimentary understanding of language, mostly were illiterate, but they learned to do things in the household from their mothers. Sometimes they even learned a trade from their mothers. But in this 18th century, more and more it became customary for girls to go to small village schools. Parish schools, if you like, in which they, next to young boys, learned some rudimentary knowledge, got some rudimentary knowledge on letters and some arithmetics, but that was only very rudimentary. Girls from the upper classes were more and more educated in their homes by governesses, and Mary Wollstonecraft was herself a governess for 1 year and a half to the Viscount, to an Irish Viscount and his wife. I will tell this later. But more and more people from the upper bourgeoisie, from the upper classes in the cities, who earned quite a lot of money in business, agriculture, found it appropriate that their daughters as well, like the daughters of the nobility, should obtain a decent education. It was still not the same as the education of the boys, but it improved, definitely. In Catholic countries, you had monasteries. More and more monasteries were devoted to giving some sort of education to girls. And usually these girls spend there 1 or 2 years, and after that going back to their homes, and they got some rudimentary education there as well. But the 18th century is especially known because a huge amount of private schools developed, came into being. And Mary Wollstonecraft herself created one private school of her own, destined for girls from the bourgeoisie whose parents were not able to finance a governess at home, but still found it important and had some money left to have their daughters receive some education. And that is one of the most important educational institutions of the 18th century, especially in England, as it made possible for more and more girls to become really literate, not only being able to decipher some letters, but also able to write down, write some small things, which was seen as appropriate and useful. But fortunately, there were amongst these girls who started to develop their literacy, more and more women and girls are coming out who were able to write, and write not only themselves, but also write for the public. And amongst them was Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft had, in her developing years, she had some intense, very important contacts with what is called the English radicals. The English radicals were seen as the political outcome of the new Enlightenment ideas. If you say some, well, they were committed to democratic improvements because, well, there was some more influence of the people, especially from the upper classes, on the government than in other countries in Europe, but still there were many people who were not represented and had a say in the government and politics. And one of the first people who started to write against that and act against that was John Wilkes. He was a member of parliament. One time he was agitating against the government of George III and pleading for more influence of the people on the election of members of parliament. He was sometimes locked up in the Tower. He was sent away from England, had to flee. He lost his seat of parliament, but through judicial procedures was able to get it back. A more important and a greater movement was the movement of the association. The association was a movement in which local intellectuals, radicals, if you might say so, people from the lower bourgeoisie assembled and developed some ideas how to improve the democratic, the democracy in cities and boroughs and in the country as a whole. And through these associations, these local and associations in counties, they developed an idea to obtain, to resemble a grand national association. And the most important philosophers and politicians behind it were Burke and Cartwright. It never came to a grand national association, but well, one can say politics in England was becoming more and more intense, more and more contested. And this was mainly due also due to the rebellion of the American colonies. In 1776, the United States of America gave the American Declaration of Independence and dissolved themselves from the British Empire. Lasted 7 years of war between the British troops and the Americans, but it ended with the total independence of the American colonies and the coming into being of the United States of America. And there were some English radicals who were a great propagator and great enthusiastic for this American Revolution. Among them were a group of what we call dissenters. Intellectuals who were not a member of the Church of England and for that not able to study on a regular university or obtaining a job in the government or in the army. But they instituted themselves the dissenting academies, and these dissenting academies were one of the sources of radical Enlightenment ideas. And one of these dissenters and radical thinkers was Dr. Richard Price, who wrote in the year of the American Declaration of Independence a book on civil liberty, in which he propagated and put forward some ideas to enlarge the democratic standard of British society. Thomas Paine was another of these radicals. He even changed citizenship from English to American, and he was one behind the American Revolution. He also was for a long time involved with the French Revolution. And he wrote a very famous treatise, I will come on that later, on the rights of man. Quite obviously, although the English radicals managed to obtain some minor improvements, more transparency in the deliverance of jobs in the English government, and for sure, understandably, they welcomed the arrival of the French Revolution in 1789 with great enthusiasm, because they thought that the new democratic wave that was going through France would come over the channel and influence the, in their view, very autocratic English way of governing the nation. So these radicals started to assemble around corresponding societies aimed at giving moral support to the French revolutionaries. And one of the leading figures behind it was this man, William Godwin, the second husband of Mary Wollstonecraft. And Mary Wollstonecraft herself was intimately involved in these corresponding societies and the radicals. The radical movement extinguished the more the French Revolution radicalized and the more violence was coming out, especially when England went to war with France in 1793 after the decapitation of the French king. It was over and out for the radicals and over and out for any movement into more democracy in England. Well, it's about time that we start speaking about Mary Wollstonecraft herself. She was born in 1759 in the London area of Spitalfields. Her father was a moderate businessman. He had a cloth industry he had inherited from his father, and she was the second child after a son. She got two sisters and two smaller brothers, for which she was spending a lot of energy during her life. She was really a family woman as well. In 1768, the whole family moved to Yorkshire because her father, Edward Wollstonecraft, had not been able to maintain the prosperity of his father with the clothing industry, had failed in his attempt to become a moderate, good earning farmer. He was especially a man of well, a lot of jobs, but hardly any success. Besides that, he was an aggressive and a drinking man, not the kind of warm father one would have liked to have. In Yorkshire, she spent some years, and there she developed at first some genuine interest in Enlightenment ideas, because she followed some lectures on natural science and all kinds of other Enlightenment developments. The family came back to London when she was about 16 years old, and there she developed a very intimate friendship with Fanny Blood. Fanny Blood was her best friend for quite a lot of years. Not for a long time. She stayed in London because her family, due to because the houses were so expensive in London, decided to move over to Wales. And the situation in-house was not very agreeable, with a drinking, aggressive father and a submissive mother. So Mary Wollstonecraft decided to become a companion lady to a rich lady who spent her summer months in Bath. She found this an extremely boring job. So after some 2 years, she took leave, and she went back to the family, who had been back to London again, and there she began to take care of her mother, who was quite ill. She tended for her mother for about a year when her mother died, and after that she took care of her younger sister, Eliza, who was by that time married, had got a child, but was suffering from a postnatal depression. And Mary Wollstonecraft, already by that time, due to the bad example of her parents, was very negative about the whole institute of marriage, and she blamed the state of marriage for her sister to become depressed. So what she did is she took away her sister out of the house. They ran away to the south of London, hid away in a hidden apartment, and she took Eliza and the youngest sister, Everina, she took with her to the place of Newton Green, where they started in 1783 a school, a girls' school. She had already been interested in education. So it was quite natural for her, like a lot of women of her age with some education but not already engaged or in marriage, it was quite natural to start a career as a teacher. Not only that, she founded a girls' school. And Newington Green was important because that was a place where a lot of dissenters and radicals assembled. She met there in Newington Green, for instance, Samuel Johnson was not actually a radical, but had some great cultural influence. But more important, she met there Dr. Richard Price, and she became befriended with him. Newington Green, she ruled with the help of her two younger sisters, but also with Fanny Blood, who came to work there as a teacher. But Fanny, however, got engaged, married, and went off to Portugal. In Portugal, she became quite ill during her pregnancy, and Mary dashed off to Portugal to help her friend. But unfortunately, Fanny got a child, but died as a consequence of childbirth. Mary Wollstonecraft was deeply grieved. She went back by ship to England, and she managed to play a hero's role because on the way they passed by a sinking ship, and the captain of the ship on which Mary Wollstonecraft was sailing refused to take in the ship wrecks, but she threatened to give him in with the authorities if he didn't so, and that is why she saved the lives of many people who were about to drown in the water. She recounted this story in one of her first books, A Mary, a Fiction. Well, she came back, and what was she about to do? She definitely didn't want to go back to her father's house to live there. The prospects of her school had become very gloomy, and it went bankrupt 1 year, some time after she came back. So she decided to become a governess in Ireland to Viscount and Lady Kingsborough in Cork, especially for the three younger daughters of the couple. But as a governess, she found it very hard to be the servant and to be treated as such by Lady Kingsborough, who obviously, in the views of Mary Wollstonecraft, was intellectual, far her junior, far inferior to her. You might call this a haughty appearance, a haughty stand. However, it became unbearable for Lady Kingsborough, and so she was dismissed after 1 year. In these years, she also developed some, as one might call it, psychosomatical diseases. She fainted sometimes, she got headaches, she felt quite miserable many times. I give here a small talk about a letter she has written out about it in this time. Some subtracts from her diary. I am sick with vexation, wish I could knock my foolish head against the wall. That bodily pain might make me feel less anguish from self-reproach. To say the truth, I was never more displeased with myself. Perhaps you can scarcely conceive the misery I at this moment endure. Surely it is hell to despise oneself. I shall not call on you this month, not stir out. My stomach has been so suddenly and violently affected, I am unable to lean over the desk. Well, this obviously indicates a woman who was troubled by herself. During her time as a governess and after that, she was reading a lot of books, especially books about medical treatment. And whereas at first she blamed her sensitivity and her illnesses on her being too sensitive, she gradually began to see that there might also be some medical issue. It never was found out what was really mattering here, but obviously she was not satisfied with her life. This changed a bit when she met the publisher Joseph Johnson. Joseph Johnson was an important publisher. He had his publishing business and his printing firm next to St. Paul's Cathedrals in London, and it was he who invited her to become an editor in his firm. And that's what she began to do in 1788. And then she started writing books on girls' education, but also writing essays, reviews about other books of other people. And that became then her next job and her next professional career. After teaching, she became now an editor. During the time with the publishing firm of Joseph Johnson, she met in London quite a few of the radicals and the radical movement, amongst whom other was Thomas Paine, amongst whom was also William Godwin, whom she later would marry. And during these meetings with the radicals, she became more and more interested in politics. And it was once the revolution started that she actively began writing about revolutionary topics, just as human rights. And it was mainly due because 1 year after a revolution came ahead in France, there was a famous writing of Edmund Burke, Reflections on the Revolution in France, which took a very conservative and negative stand on the French Revolution, in which he indicated that politics should not be based on reason but on tradition, generally, broadly speaking. And that was the incentive for her to start writing a book about the vindication of the rights of man. And quickly after that, following by Thomas Paine's more famous and more broadly known Rights of Man. But in the spur of the moment, she started to develop her own thoughts about the rights of women. And this is the starting point of the very famous Vindication of the Rights of Women, which appeared in 1792 and which I will deal with in one of the next slides. However, Mary Wollstonecraft was still spinster and was not very happy with his life. Although she found it important, and that is what she stated, to lead an independent life as a woman, there were also belongings and the yearnings of the heart. And this was brought to well, near crisis because she became involved, she became infatuated with a Swiss painter called Henry Fuseli. He was also a member of the group of the radicals, but he was already married and he didn't fancy Mary, although she proposed that they should have a ménage à trois. And she became, as to say, emotionally desperate. And so especially after the monarchy had fallen in France, after the king had abdicated in 1792, she decided, also a bit desperate, to go to Paris and there to watch closely by how the French Revolution was developed. As a journalist and an editor for the firm of Joseph Johnson. She was the main editor of a journal called The Analytical Review, that started some years before that, and which was keeping itself busy with also all kinds of political reviews. In Paris, she became part of the group of English expats, amongst whom Helen Mary Williams, and also Thomas Paine. And there is when she met some months later in 1793 Gilbert Imlay. And Gilbert Imlay was an American. He was, as you might call them, an adventurer or an entrepreneur. He worked for the new Republican government of France, obtaining provisions from elsewhere, and they became lovers. And this was totally absorbing first experience for Mary Wollstonecraft to be involved and to be in love and to love someone else. She became pregnant, and during 1794, she gave birth to her first daughter called Fanny after her friend, her youth friend. Fanny was born on the 14th of May, 1794. Gilbert Imlay was very much on the move. He was a lot of times he was abroad obtaining provisions for the revolutionary government. So Mary Wollstonecraft didn't see him much. She was busy in these days, in these months, with writing a book on the French Revolution, which was edited some years later. And she moved over to Le Havre, so be more able to meet him whenever he was in France. But the more he stayed away, the more insecure she became. And especially in the extremely cold and desperate winter of 1795, she became increasingly desperate about his abstinence. She started to become very insecure. She started also to become very emotionally, as to say, harassing him to come over and to take care of her and her daughter. But the moment that she came back to London in 1795, she discovered that he already didn't want to have intercourse with her anymore, and this made her to do the first suicide attempt with laudanum. Gilbert Imlay visited her in a house in London, and he felt responsible for her and for her daughter, but he was by that time withdrawing himself even more and more from the relationship, and then he proposed. She made a journey to Sweden because he had some business to do in Sweden, and he thought it might be good for her to go away, well, for him to have some time free. So this she did. She took with her her maid and the little Fanny. She moved to Sweden, being quite depressed already because in the meantime she kept sending letters to Imlay and yearning for his attention, which he less and less answered. She even wrote, when she came back, he wrote a journey, a book about her journey to Sweden, but then she recovered when she came back in London that he had an affair, he was living together with another woman. And that is when she tried to do the second attempt to kill herself. And I will read what the Times said about this incident. On Saturday fortnight, a lady, elegantly dressed, took a boat from one of the stairs in the Strand and ordered the waterman to row up to Putney, where landing she paid him 6 shillings and immediately, going upon Putney Bridge, threw herself from the frame of the central arch into the Thames. Fortunately, she was picked up by a fishing boat and being carried to an inn at Fulham, was soon restored by the skill of one of the medical persons belonging to the Humane Society. She told her place of abode and added that the cause of this, which was the second act of desperation she had attempted on her life, was the brutal behavior of her husband. In about 2 hours afterwards, a coach came with her maid and a proper change of apparel, when she was conveyed home, perfectly recovered. And she was deeply depressed and bitter as well because her suicide attempt had miscarried, had failed. But she wrote about it. I have only to lament that when the bitterness of death was past, I was inhumanly brought back to life in misery. But a fixed determination is not to be baffled by disappointment. Nor will I allow that to be a frantic attempt, which was one of the calmest acts of reason. In this respect, I am only accountable to myself. Did I care for what is termed reputation, it is by other circumstances that I should be dishonored. So she was firmly determined to kill herself because she couldn't stand the loss of Gilbert and May anymore. Nevertheless, by one or another reason, she managed to come over it, and more than that, a year later, she met again William Godwin. She got into friendship with him, and quite quickly they become lovers. They even secretly married in the beginning of 1797. She got pregnant, um, and she gave birth to her second daughter, who was called Mary. It was in the end of August of 1797. But unfortunately, the rests of the afterbirth were inside, began to infect, and after some week after the birth of Mary, she died of blood poison. Her young daughter Mary, became the later known writeress Mary Shelley, the writers of, amongst others, Frankenstein. Mary Wollstonecraft as a person is to be described as a woman of great abilities, but also great inattentions. From a young child of, she was known as due to her moral indignation. She felt utterly ill-treated because her elder brother was much more favored than she was, both by her parents and by her grandfather, who left him a lot of money, but she got nothing. And this moral indignation, especially about the situation of women, was a lifelong passion of hers. And I will give now a part of some of her letters about the situation of the women. It was shortly after her girl Fanny was born. You know my opinion of men in general. You know that I think them systematic tyrants, and that it is the rarest thing in the world to meet with a man with sufficient delicacy of feeling to govern desire. When I am thus sad, I lament that my little darling, fondly as I dote on her, is a girl. I am sorry to have her tied to a world that for me is ever sown with thorns. And this moral indignation and this great moral demands, she was the first victim to say so. That means she had a very high, stern moral standards, which she suffered for herself the most part of it. In the first place, because her strong moral conscience made her feel very responsible for her family. And for many years, she was involved with taking care of her younger sisters, providing them with jobs, taking care of their sorrows, providing them with money. Not only that, also a younger brother who was in the Navy but was a ne'er-do-well. Whereas her elder brother, Edward, who became an attorney, didn't do much about it. She even, although she despised him, took care of her father in his latter days. So this is why she might be called the prototype of a very stern teacheress, and you can see in the gaze of her looks how it her high moral standards made her also a very prudish woman till 1793. And you can read that when you read Vindication of the Rights of Women. That she sees sex as something which is despisable because it leads to moral corruption, both of men and women. Whereas men cannot control themselves, women abuse this lack of control, and this leads to all kinds of character um, defects. This changed after she became, well, as to say, involved in a relationship. But it was during her relationship that it came out that she had huge scars of emotional neglect, which she had had as a child, being both neglected by her father and her mother. And it was this, well, as you might say, a craving for love, as you might call it, that she first discovered and say something that she discovered and diagnosed as hypersensitivity, but which turned out more and more that she was addicted to love and addicted to the attention and addicted to the attention and the love of Gilbert Imlay. And when she was thus unable to develop a grown-up attitude towards love and towards relationship, she became very depressed, and which led her to suicide attempts. So this strong tension between her high moral standards and her also strong emotional yearnings is very characteristic of Mary Wollstonecraft as a person. So you might not call a very happy woman, of course. That is quite clear. Although you must say she made the best of it, and still in the end dying as a happy wife and a mother, or as happy as she could be. We'll now start to talk something about the writings of Mary Wollstonecraft. As I told, she started her career as a teacher, and her first publications were concerned with teaching girls. One important book was Thoughts on the Education of Daughters and Original Stories. Also, a lot of her reviews in the analytical review were about education books. And for her, education is the key to morals, the key to success, the key to happiness. One of her thoughts is written in her review of the French Revolution, where she says, "It is by thus teaching men from their youth to think that they will be enabled to recover their liberty, and useful learning is already so far advanced that nothing can stop its progress." She was a stern believer in the value of education, and she thought that liberation of women should also therefore start with education. But also her the importance of morals, the importance of developing morals and moral virtue was not only seen in her works of education, but also in her novels. The first novel was Mary, a fiction, a rather gloomy novel about a woman basically based on her own life, who is going after a friend and seeing her friend die, coming back, and then seeing the futility of marriage and how marriage can wreck a woman's morals. And her importance to develop morals is so important for her that she says, for instance, "Alas, it is morals, not feelings, which distinguish man from the beast of prey." And that is also why she may have developed a blind spot for her own feelings, her feelings of neglect, her anxiety of loss, and all kinds of other things, because she thought that morals should prevail over feelings. Then she wrote the two books on the rights of man, the rights of man and the rights of woman. I will turn on this later, which are very well, important contribution to the thoughts about the rights of men. And she then wrote a historical and moral view of the origins and progress of the French Revolution, which you could hardly call a factual story of the revolution. There are some facts in it, but mostly it is moral analysis of what happened during the French Revolution and why it came about and why it turned to be such a bloody mess, if you may say so. But what is interesting that although, and she had been witnessing the worst sides of the French Revolution herself during the years that she lived in France, she still believed in the rights of man and the good intentions behind what happened in the French Revolution. So she wrote about the French Revolution. Several acts of ferocious folly have justly brought much obloquy on the Grand Revolution which has taken place in France. Yet, I feel confident of being able to prove that the people are essentially good and that knowledge is rapidly advancing to that degree of perfectibility when the proud distinctions of sophisticating fools will be eclipsed by the mild rays of philosophy and man be considered as man acting with the dignity of an intelligent being. And then, of course, one of her latest works is Letters from Sweden. She was busy writing a novel called Maria when she died, and this novel was later on finished and published by her husband, William Godwin, and which is more readable, although very gloomy about the prospect of woman, especially in marriage. The most important book, of course, from Mary Wollstonecraft is Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And I shall read a part of her introductory remarks, how she came to write this book. I have turned over various books written on the subject of education and patiently observed the conduct of parents and the management of schools. But what has been the result? A profound conviction that the neglected education of my fellow creatures is the grand source of the misery I deplore, and that women in particular are rendered weak and wretched by a variety of concurring causes originating from one hasty conclusion. The conduct and manners of women, in fact, evidently prove that their minds are not in a healthy state. One cause of this barren blooming I attribute to a false system of education gathered from the books written on the subject by men who, considering females rather as women than human creatures, have been more anxious to make them alluring mistresses than affectionate wives and rational mothers. She starts this book with writing that whereas Rousseau had seen that whereas people are not equal, we should go back to nature. No, says Mary Wollstonecraft, we should not get back to nature, but we should go ahead and seeing that whereas there's a lot of inequality, especially between men and women, we should go at finding about the sources, the intellectual sources of this inequality and trying to improve it. Well, the main thesis of this book is that the lack of education for girls keeps them ignorant and therefore suppressed. This suppression leads to moral corruption, bigotry, vanity, stupidity, false humbleness, and keeping up appearances. And that is why the general conclusion of this book is that women should have the same rights as men and become independent. And therefore, she ends the book, or rather writes in the end, let woman share the rights and she will emulate the virtues of man. And that is the general message. There is no whatsoever difference in intelligence between the women, only the prejudice of man that women might not be as intelligent and not apt to learning makes women really dull and dumb and makes them behave in an undignified way. I will come now to some general conclusions about Mary Wollstonecraft and her thoughts, especially her thoughts on the rights of women, which she developed in the mainstream of the Enlightenment ideas of liberating man from the clutches of religion and superstition. The first conclusion is that the lack of education is the main cause of injustice done to women. Injustice done to women is degrading for everyone. She says we all have in society, we have a need, and we can benefit if women are able to have the same education and same educational opportunities as men. She also is not very lenient about women themselves. You say this difference is kept alive by women themselves. They can hardly be blamed for that, because they have to develop all kinds of strategies to maintain themselves in a society which is an unequal society. That is why they began to develop the special loathsome tricks that women are notorious for. And she puts that in a larger view of education, saying moral development is the main target of education. Education in general has as a main is to develop ourselves as virtuous, moral, responsible, and morally independent human beings, and that in general is both helpful for the private life and for the political life. Once we are able to have a good system of education, educating both boys and girls, becoming them to responsible people, moral education, that will be the panacea for every possible social and economic problem. In the meantime, you see in the life of Mary Wollstonecraft, her ideas, but also much more her life, the way she has been struggling with her own moral demands, that there is always a tension between the moral demands of becoming independent, becoming a responsible human being, and your emotional needs. If you have been neglected in your life, if you have been degraded, if you have been humiliated, if you have been battered and all kinds of injustice that is done, especially to women, then it's very difficult to uphold this moral standard and to develop yourself. So both her teachings and her life are either on the one hand are a strong moral appeal to get rid of the inequality which still is in some parts between men and women, but on the other hand, being empathic to all kinds of emotional needs and understanding why women, but also why men, behave as they do, because they are stuck in a kind of system, which not, of course, is the same as being having to accept it. We are all able and morally obliged to change something about it. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I will finish off with a question that I would like to pose. This is a question which I normally open for discussion once I have a group that I'm lecturing to, but unfortunately through to this device I cannot talk about with you personally, which I regret. But I would like you to think, if you have enjoyed this discussion or perhaps becoming interested in the life and works of Mary Wollstonecraft, what can we learn of Mary Wollstonecraft? I have given some clues of myself, what I can think that Mary Wollstonecraft is still important and still learnable about it, both her writings and her life. But I would like to invite you to think about this question. And what is more, if you find anything interesting about life and works of Mary Wollstonecraft, please share your findings with me. You can do this, for instance, by sending me an email. An email is jocelyn@hetnet.nl. Of course, it is a Dutch email address, but I hope I could have inspired you to some thoughts about Mary Wollstonecraft and general other thoughts. I'm looking forward to it, and I thank you very much for your interest and your attention.